Hey guys, how's it going? Jeff here, and I'm here with an LD topic breakdown for September and October of 2018. So we're going to just be breaking down what the topic means here. This is not a full topic analysis that's been coming on the channel later in a couple days, maybe in a couple hours, depending on how fast that gets done by our writers. But this is just breaking down what the topic means and what you want to expect the topic area to be under. Okay, so first things we have to break down is the resolution right here. So the resolution is, in the United States, reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources. So we're going to be breaking down what that really means and what that means for what you're going to be putting in your cases and what arguments you want to go for on this topic. Okay, so the first part, in the United States. Now, this part seems super obvious. It seems to go without saying, but basically that just means that topicality is limited to the United States. However, there are important things to know. This means that it's possible for the neg to make some level of international referendum counterplan if it's possible, if it's provided outside of the United States, and also gives the affirmative the burden of providing US specific reasons on why reporters should have this right. So on to the second point, the international referendum counterplan, while it is possible, it will be extremely difficult for negatives to try to bring this point up due to the fact that it has very little room for competition with the AF. So if you're planning or thinking along these lines, the thing you want to think about is, what can I do to provide decent competition with the AF in order to prevent the simple competition response on the counterplan. Now, the third thing on the US specific reason on why reporters should have this right, this means that you're going to be looking for evidence on why reporters in the US need this right. Anything talking about other countries is somewhat extra topical unless you're going on the neg for the international referendum counterplan. So that's the reason why we need to be looking toward that sort of thing right there. All right, so the second part of the resolution states that reporters ought to have. Now, this seems really, really simple, except when you understand this part right here, that this right applies to the reporters. It does not apply to the source. So that means when we're arguing on what rights should be respected, we're not really as concerned about the rights of the source as we are as the rights of the reporters. Yes, I know it seems to be one and the same, as in the reporters should be protecting the rights of the source. However, by a technicality, the rights of the source are not what is essential to the debate right here. So that's a really important thing you need to understand when you're getting into this topic, that we're talking about the rights of the reporter, not the source. So even if you state that it would be wrong for the source to have their identity divulged, if you agree that reporters should not have the right to keep that identity away from someone, then the AF would still lose that round because of the nature of the resolution. It's asking what should the reporters be allowed to do or not allowed to do. Okay, now we got that out of the way. So this also means that rights based off the source on the First Amendment, that's not really what we're looking towards here. And it should be, like I said, based off the rights of the reporters and whether or not they should be forced to divulge the identity for their sources. So another important thing to note right here is that this means technically arguments on self-incrimination are not invalid because the reporter would not be incriminating themselves, but a third party. I know you might think self-incrimination might be in play here, but if you were thinking under the idea that we need to be protecting the rights of the source. However, since it's through a reporter, that is technically not self-incrimination, so that's still legal under a constitutionality framework or understanding of the topic. Now, another thing to note here is the word ought. Now, if you're experienced in Lincoln Douglas, you already know the whole deal with the word ought. If you aren't, then here I am to teach you right here. So here's the pro tip right here. Ought happens to be the most frequently used word in any Lincoln Douglas topic. So the first thing you need to understand is define what does ought mean. The most simple definition I've seen and most common definition that is used is the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, which is moral obligation. So what you need to understand here is that ought is very important on what parameters are necessary to prove, to negate, or affirm. So when you're debating, it's important to understand what ought means and what you want to prove on your burden, it's the affirmative or the negative, on what you want the judge to be voting on based off your arguments. And like what do you need to achieve in order to have a path to the ballot? All right, I'll get more into detail in a different video on like the importance of the word ought, but we're going to leave that for now and move on to the next section. All right, so the final section right here is the right to protect the identity of confidential sources. So the first thing to note right here is not what it says, but what it doesn't say right here. It does not say the right to protect from whom. It just says the right to protect, which is really, really important here because this means that it's open-ended who this right protects reporters from. So it not just protects them from the government, which is probably based on political atmosphere, what most people would assume this topic's going to be about, but it also applies to things like employers, other companies, family members, anyone where the identity of that source might be an interest to that person. This right under the resolution would protect that reporter from divulging the identity of that source to that entity or person. So that's an important thing you need to understand, that it's not just the government. A lot of people might argue the right to protect the identity of sources from the government, but there are other people that would want the identity of that source. Okay, so the second thing we have to do is identify what is a confidential source and what qualifies one. So according to US legal, a confidential source is a person who provides information to a law enforcement agency or journalist on the express or implied guarantee of anonymity. All right, so basically what that means is that if that source expects that when they give this information to the journalist that their identity will not be known, that means they are a confidential source. So another thing to note right here under legality purposes, that confidentiality is protected under the Federal Freedom of Information Act for disclosures to law enforcement and the First Amendment to disclosures to journalists. So if you see someone arguing under the idea that we're protecting the rights of the sources, both of those things, like divulging information to law enforcement and divulging information to journalists, are protected. So the sources are actually legally protected from having their sources revealed by the government. However, journalists are not legally bound to not reveal their sources. There's nothing that makes journalists legally binding that they have to protect their sources or they have a right to protect their sources. All right, so that's another distinguishing thing you need to understand with this topic. Another thing you have to understand is that in the definition, it says express or implied. So this means that there doesn't have to be an outright expectation or a formal agreement there has to be an expectation, but there doesn't have to be a formal agreement between the two parties that I'm exchanging information and you don't tell anyone who I am. There does not have to be a formal agreement of any kind. It just has to be some level of understanding on both parties that this person does not want their identity to be known. So if there is some level of understanding between the journalist and the source, this means they're considered a confidential source. Now this makes things really, really difficult for the negative because they're unable to really say who is a confidential source and who is not a confidential source. However, this gives really good advantages to the affirmative because this allows them to move the topic and uses a bunch of people as examples that they're as confidential sources who need their identity protection or reporters, or it gives them a lot more access to information or instances that would really put them in an advantage in the debate. Okay, so for review. So this topic takes place in the US, obviously, but the main thing to take away from there is that on the negative, you have the potential for using using outside of the US as research or as your resource in order to try to negate the resolution right there, or use some sort of international referendum counterplan right there. The second thing is it applies to the reporter, not the sources. The sources are already protected under law, under the Freedom of Information Act and the First Amendment, so they're actually good. They're fine. The real things we're dealing with is what the rights of the reporters are in these scenarios. Are the reporters required to divulge that information? Do they have the right to not divulge that information? All of that is up for debate here in this debate. All right, and the third thing right here, it only applies to sources that have some level of expectation to remain anonymous. So that means that if they feel that they should have remained anonymous, then that means they're technically a confidential source. This makes some murky waters for what should the reporter expect. So that's some things you want to really figure out and really think about when you're researching for this topic. All right, so thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to Lightning Debate, and I'll see you guys around. Jeff out.